The world changed while most Americans were still arguing about it. Right now, in April of 2026, we are watching something unfold in real time that is going to define the next century of human civilization. And I'll be honest with you, most people in this country still don't fully understand the gravity of what is happening. We are standing at a genuine historical inflection point, not the kind that gets manufactured by cable news for ratings, but the kind that historians write about 50 years later and say, that was the moment. That was when the balance of power truly shifted. China has just passed its new 5-year plan, running from 2026 to 2030, and researchers who study Chinese science policy are openly saying what a few years ago would have seemed unthinkable. 5 years ago, the sentiment of Chinese science policymakers was still about not falling too far behind the United States, still catching up. Now, there is a more palpable sentiment that there is a real chance China can be a true leader. Let that sink in. Not a challenger, not a competitor, a leader. The Chinese themselves are no longer thinking about catching up. They are thinking about pulling ahead. And what makes this moment so profound, so genuinely alarming if you care about American power and American sovereignty, is that the evidence on the ground is starting to back that confidence up. According to the Stanford AI Index Report 2025, China now trails only the United States in frontier model releases while leading the world in AI patents, research output, and open model activity. Trails only the United States, but leads the entire world in patents and research output. Think about what that means structurally. It means the foundation being built underneath China's AI ambitions is broader, deeper, and more durable than almost anything being discussed in Washington right now. That is the hook. That is the reality. And if you are an American who cares about where this country is going, you need to understand every single layer of what is actually happening. Let me take you back to January of 2025, because that is where this story really cracked open for the American public. Chinese tech startup DeepSeek shocked the world by releasing 2 large language models that rivaled the performance of dominant tools developed by US tech giants, but that were built at a fraction of the cost and computing power needed to train their US counterparts. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. The entire American strategy for maintaining dominance in artificial intelligence rested on one fundamental assumption, that if you could control the most advanced computer chips and restrict China's access to them, you could slow China down enough that American companies would maintain their lead. That was the theory. Export controls on semiconductors, restrictions on NVIDIA's most advanced GPUs. The idea that hardware scarcity would be the wall that China couldn't climb over. And then in January 2025, a relatively small Chinese startup walked right around that wall. They built a model that competed with OpenAI using dramatically less compute. They didn't go over the wall. They didn't go through it. They made the wall irrelevant. And that right there is a signal of something deeper than just one company's technical achievement. It is a signal of a strategic adaptation that should have every serious policymaker in Washington deeply, deeply concerned. U.S. policy advisors now openly warn that China's open source momentum is creating a self-reinforcing competitive advantage. And this is something I want to explain carefully because it gets to the heart of the strategic picture. When China releases AI models as open source, freely available for anyone to download, modify, and deploy, they are not being generous. They are being strategically brilliant. Every developer in the world who builds something on top of a Chinese open source model becomes part of China's technological ecosystem. Every startup in Africa, every government in Southeast Asia, every small company in Eastern Europe that integrates Chinese AI into their systems becomes, in a meaningful sense, dependent on the Chinese AI stack. In 2026, expect China to double down on its open source AI strategy to influence the world's AI infrastructure. Several major US tech companies are already using Chinese large language models in their applications. Read that again slowly. American tech companies are already using Chinese AI models, not because they were forced to, because the Chinese models are good enough and in many cases cheap enough to make business sense. That is how ecosystems get captured, not through coercion, through utility. Now, when I talk about the economics of this competition, the numbers are genuinely staggering, and I think it's important to be honest about where America still has real advantages and where those advantages are eroding. For 2025, US AI capital expenditure by Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and Google was at least $350 billion compared to less than $40 billion for China's major cloud providers. For 2026, Bloomberg Intelligence estimates the same 4 tech giants will spend more than $400 billion. So in raw investment terms, America is outspending China by nearly 10 to 1. That sounds like an overwhelming advantage, and in some dimensions it is. The frontier AI models, the most powerful, most sophisticated systems, still come predominantly from American labs. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, these are still the cutting edge. And American chips, NVIDIA's GPUs specifically, still power the majority of serious AI training globally. These are real advantages, and I won't pretend otherwise. But here is where the analysis has to get more sophisticated, because the question of who wins the AI race is not simply a question of who spends more money on the most powerful models. The race is evolving into a split leadership model, US strength in brains, China's lead in bodies. Think about what that means in practice. The brains, the frontier models, the reasoning systems, the premium software, America leads there. But the bodies, the physical deployment of AI into the real world, into factories, into logistics systems, into robotics, into the infrastructure of daily economic life, that is where China is accelerating past everyone else on the planet. China now accounts for the vast majority of global humanoid robot shipments, while cities such as Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Chongqing have integrated autonomous systems deeply into logistics, delivery, and factory operations. We are not talking about prototypes in a lab. We are talking about deployed, functioning, economically productive AI systems operating at scale in the real world right now. And the economics of China's physical AI ecosystem are genuinely alarming from an American competitive standpoint. China's robotics champion, Unitree, now sells its G1 humanoid robot for $16,000, about one-tenth the cost of comparable Western systems. This is why China shipped 10 times as many robots as Boston Dynamics to customers in 100 countries last year, 10 times as many to 100 countries, at one-tenth the price. That is not a gap. That is a chasm. And when you project that trajectory forward 5 years, 10 years, you start to see something that should genuinely keep American strategists awake at night. The countries that build their industrial base on Chinese robotics, Chinese AI systems, Chinese technological infrastructure are going to be structurally intertwined with Beijing in ways that no amount of diplomatic pressure or trade restriction can easily undo. This is how spheres of influence are built in the 21st century, not with military bases, with technology stacks. Let me turn now to the military dimension, because this is where the analysis becomes truly consequential. China can take a capability that begins as a commercial technique, autonomy systems, large language models, edge computing, and route it through procurement into military applications, then scale those applications through follow-on contracting, organizational learning, and doctrinal experimentation. This is what the Chinese call military-civil fusion, and it is one of the most strategically significant policy architectures in the world today. It means there is no wall between China's commercial technology sector and its military. A company like Unitree builds affordable robot dogs for consumers and research labs. And then China's state broadcaster aired footage of Unitree's B-1 quadrupeds carrying assault rifles in joint military exercises between the Chinese and Cambodian armed forces. The company didn't choose to weaponize its product. The Chinese Communist Party brought the military to the company through a system that required no direct order, no classified contract. It is built into the institutional architecture of how China organizes its economy. And the implications of that for American national security are profound. The People's Liberation Army is moving out quickly to acquire AI systems, with many of the requests for proposals specifying acquisition timelines of only 3 to 6 months. 3 to 6 months. Compare that to the American defense acquisition process, which has historically moved at what can charitably be described as a glacial pace, where a contract for a new weapon system might take 5 years from requirement to deployment. China is cycling through AI system acquisitions in a quarter of a year. That speed differential, compounded over a decade, produces a military that learns faster, adapts faster, and fields new capabilities faster than its adversary. And in modern warfare, where the decisive advantage often goes to whoever can observe, orient, decide, and act fastest, that kind of institutional speed matters enormously. China may have surpassed the United States in AI for drone swarms. With the addition of drone carriers already in service, the PLA has taken the lead over the US military in this category of AI military applications, drone swarms. Think about what that means in the context of a potential Taiwan conflict, which remains the single most dangerous flashpoint in the world today. A coordinated swarm of AI-guided drones deployed from carriers in the Taiwan Strait represents a military capability that changes the tactical calculus in fundamental ways. The ability to overwhelm defensive systems through sheer numbers, coordinated by AI at machine speed, is not science fiction. It is operational reality being tested and refined right now, and the PLA is not sitting on this capability. The PLA is enhancing its guided missile frigate with an AI algorithm designed to illuminate blind spots during air defense engagements, calling the vessel a major leap in integrated combat capability. Layer by layer, system by system, the Chinese military is integrating AI into its warfighting apparatus. Now, I want to address something that a lot of American commentators get wrong when they discuss this competition, because intellectual honesty demands that we see this clearly. China has real vulnerabilities in its military AI development. The PLA lacks the volume of real operational data that the U.S. military has accumulated over decades of expeditionary warfare, and there are unresolved doctrinal tensions between the decentralized decision-making that effective AI-enabled operations require and the PLA's deeply embedded centralized command culture. This is a genuine structural problem for the PLA. The Chinese military hasn't fought a serious war since 1979. American forces have decades of combat experience from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and other theaters, experience that generates the operational data that trains better AI decision support systems. The PLA knows this. That is actually why they are so aggressively pursuing AI decision support tools. They are trying to use technology to compensate for the absence of battlefield experience. But here is what concerns me most about the trajectory of this competition, and it gets to something that isn't talked about enough in the American foreign policy establishment. China will launch a new 5-year plan in 2026, which includes making forward-looking plans for industries of the future, such as AI, quantum technology, and brain-computer interfaces. The government now considers science to be as important as other top-level national goals, such as boosting defense and economic growth. Science as a national priority equivalent to defense, equivalent to economic growth. That is the institutional commitment that China is making right now, and it is backed by real money. China's science budget is expected to increase to 426 billion yuan, about $62 billion this year, a rise of 10% from 2025. A 10% annual increase in science funding, sustained over the period of a 5-year plan, compounds into something extraordinary. The Chinese are not making a bet. They are making a commitment rooted in a long-term strategic vision that spans decades, not election cycles. This is perhaps the most fundamental structural difference between how America and China approach this competition. American AI policy is shaped by election cycles, by the interests of private shareholders, by the quarterly earnings reports of public companies, and by the shifting winds of political fashion in Washington. Chinese AI policy is shaped by a state that thinks in decades, that can mobilize resources nationally without the friction of democratic contestation, and that views technological supremacy not as a business opportunity, but as a civilizational imperative. China's approach emphasizes practical implementation over theoretical capabilities, with AI already transforming daily life through robot taxis, medical imaging systems, and government services. This is the diffusion model in action. America invests in building the most powerful AI. China invests in deploying AI everywhere. And the country that deploys AI everywhere generates the data, the experience, and the institutional knowledge that compounds into sustained long-term advantage. China possesses distinct advantages in global outreach. Its emphasis on open-source AI models and applied AI solutions, which are often deployment-ready and more accessible, could prove to be a winning formula for capturing market share, particularly in the global South. There are about 5 billion people living in countries that are not the United States, not Europe, not China, countries in Africa, in Latin America, in South and Southeast Asia. These are the countries that are going to be building their digital infrastructure over the next 20 years. The question of whether that infrastructure runs on American technology or Chinese technology is one of the most consequential geopolitical questions of our time. And right now, because Chinese AI is cheaper, more accessible, and actively promoted through state-backed deals and partnerships, China is winning that contest in large parts of the world. China is pushing to shape global AI standards via BRICS and ASEAN partnerships standards. This is the level at which technological dominance gets locked in. Whoever sets the standards for how AI systems communicate, how data is formatted, how security protocols work, that country shapes the technological architecture of the global economy for decades. China's AI industry enjoys significant advantages in energy infrastructure for data centers, driven by aggressive state-backed power expansion that added 429 gigawatts of net new power generation capacity in 2024 alone, more than 15 times the capacity added in the United States during the same period. 15 times. Let that number breathe for a moment. The compute infrastructure that powers AI systems requires enormous amounts of electricity. Data centers, training clusters, inference servers, they all run on power. China added 15 times more power generation capacity in a single year than the United States did. That is not a temporary fluctuation. That is a structural investment in the physical infrastructure of AI supremacy. While American policymakers have been debating permit reform for new power lines and arguing about the environmental impact of data centers, China has been building at a scale that is almost incomprehensible. And then there's the chip question, which has been at the center of American strategy for years. The theory was simple: deny China access to the most advanced semiconductors and you hobble their AI development. Since the U.S. export control order of October 2022, the AI race has become a geopolitical arms contest. Each American restriction on GPUs and chip tools has triggered Chinese countermeasures, from rare earth export limits to billion-dollar state funds for domestic fabrication. For every restriction America imposes, China responds with intensified domestic investment. China is vigorously pursuing self-sufficiency in chip production, with analysts predicting it could meet its domestic needs for inference chips by approximately 2028. 2 years from now. The window during which chip restrictions provide meaningful strategic advantage is closing, and it is closing fast. Meanwhile, the Trump administration made a decision in late 2025 that has generated significant controversy within the national security community. A contentious decision in late 2025 by the U.S. administration to allow NVIDIA to export its advanced H200 chips to China sparked significant discussion. Critics argue this move could significantly boost China's domestic AI computing power, potentially by 2 to 3 years in 2026 alone, and risk aiding China's military modernization efforts, including capabilities in nuclear weapons, intelligence gathering, and autonomous systems. 2 to 3 years of AI development advantage, potentially handed back through a single export decision. Whatever the economic rationale, whatever the diplomatic calculation behind that decision, the national security implications are serious, and they deserve a serious public debate. The honest assessment of where America stands right now is this: the United States still leads in the most powerful, most sophisticated AI models. It still controls the dominant chip manufacturing ecosystem, particularly through NVIDIA and the broader semiconductor supply chain. American private investment in AI dwarfs Chinese investment by a factor of nearly 12 to 1. These are real advantages, and they are not trivial. But the trajectory, the direction in which the trend lines are moving, tells a more complicated and more sobering story. In 2025, evidence emerged of Chinese operators using AI agents to execute cyber attacks at an unprecedented degree, as well as using generative AI to drive large-scale influence operations. The weaponization of AI for cyber and information warfare is already happening right now at scale, and the target of those operations is overwhelmingly the United States and its allies. What this moment demands is not panic. Panic is not a strategy. What it demands is clarity. It demands an honest, unblinking assessment of where American advantages are real and durable, where they are eroding, and where China has genuinely pulled ahead. China's efforts should spur Washington to develop more agile processes for military experimentation, acquisition, and adoption. The defense acquisition process in the United States has long moved at a glacial pace. Congress and the Trump administration have begun taking action to reform it, but the road ahead is long. Reform is beginning, but the urgency of the moment demands that it accelerate dramatically. The pace at which the PLA is acquiring and fielding AI systems, measured in months, not years, stands in stark contrast to the pace at which the Pentagon moves, and that gap is a national security vulnerability that no amount of raw spending can compensate for without fundamental institutional change. China's path to artificial intelligence dominance began decades before its current leadership position, and that is the lesson that America needs to internalize right now. This competition was not built in a year, and it will not be resolved in a year. What is being constructed on both sides is a multi-decade technological and strategic infrastructure that will shape every dimension of global power: economic, military, diplomatic, cultural. The country that gets this right, that builds not just the most powerful tools, but the most pervasive and deeply integrated AI ecosystem that trains the most engineers and files the most patents and sets the most international standards. That country will exercise a form of structural power in the 21st century that makes the old definitions of superpower competition look almost quaint. America stands on the edge of that contest right now. The question is whether it understands the moment it is in.